We are officially calling this meeting of the Monument Avenue Commission to order. We'd like to welcome all of you that came out to observe tonight, as was stated in the public release, as well as on the website. Tonight really is a work session for the commission. And there are several reasons for that. Most notably, as we all know, our nation has been in a bit of a crisis in the last 2 months around this question. In our own state, we've seen some real ugliness, and we all needed a little bit of time to step back, breathe, and be as thoughtful as possible as we continue this process. So even though we have had a series of conversations since August, really trying to assess what worked well, what didn't work well, how better to communicate with the public, how best for the public to communicate with us, how best for us to gather information and so forth. This is really the first time that we collectively are able to sit down and talk through some of this. And so tonight's agenda is devoted to that. Again, it's a work session. Our two major outcomes that we hope for today, actually I should say three major outcomes for this evening, is number one, we really do need to discuss the next phase of public engagement and how best to do that so that the conversations do not devolve into what we saw the last time. Number two, we need to get and we have gotten the legal opinion from Alan Jackson, city attorney, and we want him to be able to discuss with us that opinion. And then number three, just for us to touch base on what we have received so far. In fact, we've received now well over 1,200 plus letters, emails, both through the website and directly, a number of professional organizations within the city, around the state, professional organizations that have chimed in a general way as well, and so forth. So again, our goal tonight is just to make sure that all the commission members are up on as much of this information as possible. Again, that we can get the legal opinion that was made available from the city attorney, and then figure out how best to engage. That's it, right?
That's it.
That's it. Okay, so that being said, is Mr. Jackson present? If you could come forward, please.
You just sit right here, Alan. Right there.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for
Thank
coming.
you for coming.
I'm sorry, before we go, we have to do the official roll call, which I didn't do.
Okay, so just state your name and
State
go
your
down the
name,
line.
please.
Sarah Driggs, Colleen Butler Rodriguez.
Christy Coleman.
Greg Kimball.
Julie Nader.
All right, I'm sorry, Mr. Jackson.
Go ahead.
I can deal with this in either two ways or any other way, I suppose, that you like. I've already given you an extensive opinion. I can more or less briefly summarize what those conclusions are, or I can just go straight to any questions that y'all might have about it.
I think for the benefit of everyone, if you would just summarize for us.
Sure. So the basic conclusions are actually pretty straightforward. At the threshold, we have to acknowledge that the lead statute and the circle that surrounds the lead statute belong to the state. They are not subject to city control. If anything at all is to be done on that property, it must be done with the consent of the state itself. So as to the remaining statutes, Those are subject to control of City Council, ultimate control of City Council, unless council is otherwise constrained by state law. There are two kinds of relevant state law that constrain the ability of City Council to address the monuments. The first is the city's charter. The city charter is a state law that applies only to the city of Richmond. The second kind of relevant state law is laws that are found in the Code of Virginia. These are state laws also adopted by the General Assembly that apply to all localities, including the city of Richmond. Ultimately, the conclusion that that the opinion reaches is that in both of these cases, changes will have to come from the General Assembly before certain kinds of actions can be taken if that is ultimately the decision that the city makes. So let's talk first about the charter. In substance, the charter requires that historic landmarks be preserved. As I noted in the opinion, it seems to me anyway to be self-evident that these statues should be regarded as historic landmarks. If you just look at the definition, Merriam-Webster, the definition of a landmark is a structure of unusual historical and usually aesthetic interest, especially one that is officially designated and set aside for preservation. And as you all also probably know, the National Park Service regards these statues as contributing to their designation of the Monument Avenue Historic District as a National Historic Landmark. Until the General Assembly takes action to alter this duty that the city has to preserve historic landmarks, then those statues have to remain in place. The second relevant provision of state law is the one that's imposed on all localities, and that's the now somewhat infamous section 15.2-1812 of the Code of Virginia. That is the statute that prohibits anyone, including a locality, from disturbing or interfering with any monument or memorial for any war or conflict, or for any engagement of such war or conflict. There is, over the past 3 years or so, considerable litigation and discussion about the application of that statute. Originally, it was adopted in 1904. At that time, it clearly applied only to Confederate monuments and only to Confederate monuments in counties. The statute was amended several times over the years, and in 1997, it was amended to apply to all localities, including cities. Unfortunately, the language in the statute is ambiguous, and it has raised the question in at least 2 lawsuits whether the language applies to monuments or memorials that were erected by cities prior to 1997. The Danville Circuit Court ruled in, I believe, 2015 that it did not apply to monuments and memorials erected in cities prior to 1997. And last summer, the State Attorney General issued an opinion to that same effect. However, in August, I believe it was August, and then reaffirmed in June, and then reaffirmed in October, the Circuit Court in Charlottesville expressly disagreed, both with Attorney General and with Danville Circuit Court, and held that it did apply, and that therefore the Charlottesville City Council could not remove the Jackson statute and later, the Lee statute, and then later the Jackson statute as well. So until either the courts or the General Assembly resolves this issue, I've recommended that the city conform its decisions within the limitations of that statute. That statute says you may not remove the statutes. It says you may not deface the statutes. The question then becomes the question that was originally put to the committee: can context be added? And if so, what kind of context? And the opinion concludes that yes, context can be added so long as the context doesn't interfere with the opportunity of reasonable people to view the statute as, or any of the statutes as they were originally constructed. As I said, pretty straightforward. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any of the other commissioners want to ask a question of Mr. Jackson?
You said that it applies to, what were the words you used? Preserve and protect?
The way the charter reads is the city is required to preserve historic landmarks.
Preserve. And you interpret, you don't think that there's any alteration that could be done to an actual monument that would...
Since we do have a fairly large public audience, I'd ask the commissioners to use your microphone.
Just wondering if that would include altering a monument.
I don't believe it would permit it. Preserving means keep it as it is.
When did the fence go around then? The monument?
That I do not know.
Would that be considered altering it when the fence went up?
The Lee Monument is, again, I
State.
know there's a fence there that's state, and so that's,
The Davis Monument also was altered with the fence on the inside of the gazebo.
Could you use your microphone?
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
She
please
said
use the microphone so that everyone can hear you.
The Davis Monument was also altered on the inside of the exedra with a small fence at some point.
had someone asked, I would have said.
We're not taking any public questions. This is a commission meeting. Any other questions from the commissioners? We appreciate you coming and informing us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I guess it would be useful to say any discussion amongst ourselves about what we just heard.
Right. Well, we just, asking a question about the, about fencing and right-of-way, and I saw also when, I guess it was in 1958, I saw a reference to concern when the streets were paved, and there was concern about that around the time when they were altering the landscape. So, and that was done by the city predominantly at that time, and they covered over that with asphalt. I guess what I throw out, I guess, is this question is, okay, well, if by law, and we do certainly respect the rule of law, is there a way to think about this in terms of the public right-of-way? Maybe it's from the sidewalk, or maybe there is a, do you put up something that signals to people that they can tune into channel whatever on their radio if they want to read something, or, it's those kinds of questions. Does that?
Well, certainly you can put a sign up. We've put lots of signs up about this is the street and this is closed today for the parade, or.
But anything permanent, You haven't done anything current, all right?
I actually have a technical question.
Sure.
So what is the actual breadth like of the monuments themselves? Like where does the law stop and start around the perimeter? The actual
No,
structures
the
themselves?
law, as I understand the brief, the law isn't just about Monument Avenue. The law applies to any war memorial in the state.
No, that's fair. And what I'm saying is given that, like where does that monument actually stop and start, I suppose?
Right, oh,
Right.
okay.
Which, by the way, is kind of tangentially
Mhm.
related to the question you just asked about the sidewalk. And something I think that we might want to think about as we go forward, where do monuments actually begin? Where are the,
Where are the
Where are the borders?
official easements around them, and how does that work?
Right, and I would point to the very last, next to last paragraph
Mhm.
of Mr. Jackson's opinion, which says,
Because
nevertheless,
I do have some extra copies that I got. Okay. Sorry. Greg, can you-
oh, do I pass that down?
there you go.
Kim, do you have one?
Thank you.
So if we look at the very last page, the next to last paragraph, it says, nevertheless, the monuments other than the Lee statue remain the property of the city, and the median of Monument Avenue in which they are located, other than the circle surrounding the Lee statue, remain the city's property as a part of the city's right-of-way. In my opinion, placing permanent markers near the monuments that provide contextual information about them and do not either disturb the monuments themselves or interfere with the ability of reasonable people to view them would be unlikely to be held to be a violation of state law. So I think that's probably speaks to that question.
Right.
And for me, at least, that pretty much points us in the direction, for now,
Right.
that we'll be going in finishing up what was our original charge. Any other discussion?
I have another question, and this is for the city attorney. Is he still here?
Yeah.
You
Mr.
mentioned,
Jackson, are you still here?
Mr. Jackson, are you still with us, or did you leave? We may have to follow up with him.
Right.
um, I'm going to go ahead and ask my question, somebody else might know.
Go ahead.
He stated that the city charter says that we must preserve historic landmarks within the city. As far as I understand, Monument Avenue is a historic landmark district, which includes the houses, the streets, the monuments, the, medians, the trees and everything, from Birch to Roseneath, on the other side of Arthur Ashe. Would that preclude other monuments from ever going up inside that space? Because you're talking about the district and not necessarily, or is each monument a historic landmark in and of itself?
It's my understanding that two of them have, or no, just the Lee has singular historic status, is my understanding.
But the whole of it is also a National Historic
The
Landmark.
neighborhood.
Sarah, you know
I
better.
wrote the
Yeah, you wanna-
nomination, yeah. The entire avenue is a National Historic Landmark.
Okay, and there are, I do know that that designation doesn't necessarily preclude anything from the MPS side of it anyway.
Right.
But there are no restrictions associated, it's just a designation
It's, yeah,
with regard to that from the federal level,
right.
correct?
Yeah, the only protection would be a city Olden Historic District has protections. A National Historic Landmark District does not have protections.
Except for under our city charter, which says
Right.
we must preserve historic landmarks,
Right.
so no national
Yeah.
protections.
You don't need a federal mandate if you live in Monument Avenue and a garage.
Yes, you.
Yes, you do. Yeah. No, you don't need a federal, you need,
Right. A federal
You need a
mandate.
city.
Right, or a city, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a process with the state SHPO and everything, yeah. My impression, and again, I'd be fine to be corrected by Mr. Jackson, but he was using that language in terms of interpreting what a landmark, that Monument Avenue is indeed a landmark, not necessarily conflating the federal with the state law.
Right.
So-
Right,
right, not capital L.
right.
Right.
Well, finally, if it is determined that the placement of some type of marker or signage is appropriate, please keep in mind that it may become necessary to seek review by the Public Art Commission, the Commission of Architectural Review, the Urban Design Committee, the Planning Commission, and some combination of these bodies, depending on the nature of the added structures. So that being said, clearly, any recommendations coming from the public or otherwise that are included in our report would have to be mindful of that. And quite frankly, that's a step that's not in our purview. We just make the recommendation based on public input and go from there. So, but it doesn't seem that it's impossible to do it. It's just that you have to go through the appropriate steps as defined by law of how you would do it, right? Okay. All right. Nothing's ever easy in there. Okay, but you want to get it right. All right, so thanks on that. Okay. Well, if there are any other questions around this, we move on to the next agenda item?
I think so.
Okay. All right. Next, we want to talk a little bit about progress on collecting data and opinions. As was mentioned at the start of the meeting, we have been cataloging well over 1,200 letters in a database that will be turned over once they all get done. We've been, under the law, redacting individual names, last names, addresses from the public record, that sort of thing, but keeping track of every single word that's been typed into the database that's been given to us. I will admit I have not read all 1,200. I've probably read half. And the interns that have been required to sign non-disclosure agreements have been working on this for the last month or so, have been working diligently into this spreadsheet. And one of the things that I certainly noted in looking at them is that the tenor did change dramatically after August 13th. Prior to that point, what we were receiving online through the MonumentAvenueCommission.org website, the majority of the comments that came through online were in favor of keeping the monuments with one or two caveats. So, for example, there were a number of people who, either individually or through heritage organizations, made clear that they believe that the monuments should be left alone, that they are reflective of history and honor. The other group of folks who said keep them often added to their comments the desire to turn Monument Avenue into a general boulevard where we could add other monuments of the period, meaning representing the American Civil War era, were some of the other suggestions that came through in that first batch. But they were, we also had in that number, and I'm looking at the database, so forgive me, and I will share a couple of examples in just a moment. There are probably another 10 to 15% of that first batch that were completely on the opposite side of that spectrum, saying take them all down, that they are reminiscent of a shameful past. And then there are individuals in the middle, in this earlier cycle, that were asking to learn more, that why can't we add placards?
Yes.
and offered suggestions to that end. So, this one I will read to you, because this is one of the earlier ones. And I am going to please ask everyone, just listen. Whether you agree with it or not, please, just listen to what people are saying. My great-grandfather fought for the Confederate Army. He was captured and was imprisoned in Maryland. He did not fight for slavery, but because an enemy army invaded his homeland. He was a sharecropper. If you're going to remove monuments from Monument Avenue, then take them all, including Arthur Ashe. Make a no monument Ave. Do not favor one group over another. Then there was another person who said, Dear Mayor, I am in favor of keeping the monuments on Monument Avenue and elsewhere in Richmond. Richmond is so rich in history. I love driving down the street to see the beautiful works of art. I don't think the monuments have anything to do with race. Blacks and whites both fought in this war. Others that we have. We cannot sanitize history. As a career social studies educator, I never shy away from teaching the tough subjects. These are usually the subjects that most engage students. It would be a dangerous day, a very slippery slope, when we would rid ourselves of everything in which we disagree. The Monument Avenue statues are beautiful, yet do reflect a tough time for Richmond. These statues stand as a constant reminder of where we've been. The positive consequence of these statues is the reminder that we have more work to do. Taking down these statues would be a huge mistake. Instead of removing statues, how about we continue to add 20th and 21st century outstanding Richmonders? Let's see. And then there's one that's quite simple. Leave Robert E. Lee alone. Dear Mr. Mayor, I can't believe what I'm hearing. You want to change or alter the old Civil War monuments and memorials in downtown Richmond. Shame on you, sir. We must honor those brave men who gave their last full measure and called Richmond their capital. Do not change anything. Let's see here. And those are just a handful of the first 150. I'm still scrolling. I think adding to Monument Avenue is completely acceptable, but to even consider removing the Capital of the Confederacy's monument that are decades old doesn't change history, and if you think tearing them down will promote unity, you're a fool. We need to acknowledge the past and grow from it, and tearing them down would make a lot of people who appreciate the history of the city livid. There would be riots and even more issues with race if you tore them down, our monuments, and replaced them with modern ones. Once they've been taken down, they are gone for good, and that's a disgusting thing to do to the people of Richmond.
Julie?
No.
There's so many more here. I'm trying to look at some of the other ones that have come through along the spectrum even more. Okay. I agree that compromise would go a long way to show Richmond can help resolve the emotions both sides of this issue feel. Richmond is indeed in a unique position. I also remember when the monuments were green. Monument Boulevard is such a stately route with beautiful homes and roundabouts. As you look down Monument between the trees, the trees, the monuments are framed, Okay, Arthur Ashe was a great ambassador for all of Richmond. I would have preferred that the boulevard been renamed for him and his statue placed at Boulevard and Monument intersection and moving the Confederate generals to another intersection on a monument. This person goes on to suggest relocating several monuments that already exist to Monument Avenue and creating a grand boulevard of all of Richmond's heroes and heroines.
Chrissy, can I ask
Yes.
two questions?
Yes.
One, when are these going to be made available to the public? And the second is, what happened after the 13th?
That's
Are these
where I'm
the
getting to. These are
right.
all pre-13th. These are all pre-13th. So the first part of you, repeat it again for me, Julian, I'm sorry.
When will these be made?
When will they be made public?
available?
They will be made available to the public as soon as they finish, because unfortunately, what happened, unfortunately, the original submissions, when they came in, they did not drop automatically into a database. They
Okay.
do now.
All right.
So all of the ones that we got prior to that have to be manually put into this database.
All right.
And that's what's happening. Our hope was to get these done by December 1st. We're still shooting for that, to have them all up, and then that way they become available and people, to the press or anyone that wants to read them. And there are lots of them. But again, the database itself has been structured with the message, dates of the message, a simple check of keep, remove, add context, add monuments, relocate, and then specific suggestions, because some individuals did give very specific
Kim, did you have a
suggestions.
question?
Well,
Yeah.
my question is more around the technical aspect of
Mhm.
the FOIA exemption for redacting the names and addresses, because I don't really see where that's allowed, but maybe we've gotten some kind of legal opinion.
What we did is we removed the addresses, and the names are the names are certainly in the database, but it's in a blind cell.
So this, just looking at the code section, it says that the person submitting has to request that their information not be disclosed. So it looks like each individual who submitted would have to make the request that their information not be disclosed. Is that something that we,
Can you clarify that? Is that
Yes,
city
please.
code?
Is that-
I'm looking at the state FOIA exclusions from FOIA for public bodies. And it says, I lost the place where it is, but I'm just wondering if we got a legal opinion on what we can exclude and not.
We did
Because I'm
ask
not
the
sure.
city to look at how it was being set up, to make sure it was right, and
The
when...
city attorney,
Mayor's office, so if
And I'm
they went to
wondering-
the city's attorney, I don't know that answer.
I just want to make sure we're in compliance with
Absolutely.
the freedom of information.
Absolutely.
Um,
And the
we
information
can-
is still there, so if
And we
the
can
raw
ask,
data is wanted, we can certainly do that too. This was set up to make it easier to see.
and that, I'm not saying we want to disclose that, I'm saying that if we're required to, I'd rather be on the side of doing what we are required to do and not get a challenge on the part of any citizen or member of the press to say we're not in full disclosure of what the law requires. The FOIA Council is also a really good resource to find out what we're allowed to do and what we're not.
There's also a lot of state code about information that cannot be shared with the public. I mean,
Right, there's
there are
several.
records that we have here that can't be opened for 50 years. So,
So
I mean,
this is
there's
not-
obviously two sets of code there that we have to obey.
Right. The number 10 and the freedom of information specifically addresses personal contact information furnished to a public body for the purpose of receiving electronic mail from the public body, provided the electronic mail recipient has requested that the public body not disclose such information. So, and it goes on in more detail, but there may be some other applicable rules or laws or things out there. So I just
We'll
want to
seek
make
out-
sure.
We'll seek out the opinion.
I just want to make sure we're in full
compliant fully.
compliance with that, so we don't get any kind of challenge.
Absolutely.
I guess the bottom line there for me is, yes, we can get an opinion, and it's not, we have preserved that data, so
Yes,
it
absolutely.
exists, so.
Yep. All the data is there.
And I think there was a second part to Julian's question.
Yes.
Yeah, what happened after the 13th?
Okay, so that's when we get to the 500s.
Right.
So, I'm scrolling. Okay.
We're just going right into these, or?
Yes,
All right.
I'm scrolling into them. And I did highlight. Okay, this letter says, "It is with great sadness that I write you today concerning the present status of the monument debate in Richmond, Virginia. 2 weeks ago, I was pleased to join you at the Library of Virginia, where a small group of thoughtful citizens raised many issues related to these monuments and the work of your commission. You were kind enough to listen to my view that as a high school teacher in the city of Richmond, I see these monuments as historical artifacts, which I often use to teach my students about the history of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Lost Cause, as well as the difficult decisions people made in a time when nation, country, duty, honor meant different things than they do today. I expressed," this is a long letter, I'm not going to read it all, but "I expressed at the gathering the sincere hope that the monuments would not be removed, but that context, or as you remarked, information, could be added, and that long overdue recognition of diverse Richmonders might be added to Monument Avenue. Needless to say, my heart sank when our mayor announced today his plan to remove these historical pieces. As you know, our gathering occurred before the tragic events in Charlottesville, a place near and dear to me. It is a place where, as an undergraduate, I became a man, a place where I later learned to live as an adult, a place where I was married." He goes on to talk a little bit more about that. And in conclusion, he says, "The call now to remove is fraught with the same misunderstandings shared by the rank and file protesters in Charlottesville. Why I believe he seeks a positive resolution, i.e. the mayor. I know this course is anything but. Tearing down monuments will only strengthen the rhetoric and resolve of the racists. More likely, it could even drive many more to pull up. Let's see. There we go. Could drive many more towards more hateful inclinations that we saw." This was a really long letter, but that is the brunt of that one.
I should point out that that's not what the mayor said. He did not call for the removal of monuments, just to clarify.
Can I ask, I hate to monopolize.
No,
But I
I'm
have
not
a
monopolizing
real
part of it.
question, by the way, so especially given that people are here. How do we, in terms of, I know that these are going to be made public, right? But given the nature that there are so many submissions or entries, right? I'm thinking about like metadata, right?
Right.
How are we going to compartmentalize these letters into camps?
That's
right?
what that's
Right.
the purpose of the
Is this something that,
spreadsheet.
right?
Yeah.
So is this something that we should discuss, I suppose, in this?
We absolutely can.
Right.
If you think that there are other ways to do this.
I don't know.
We knew we had to get it into a spreadsheet first so that we could even begin that process.
Right.
And pulling out some of the things that kicked in here. So let me go down the list here in the section. Relocate to museums came up a lot in the specific suggestions column. The problem is, as was stated by the American Association of Museums, the Art Museum Directors Association, as well as American Association for State and Local History. We got a bunch of comments that came in through those groups as well, again, whether directly or through their general statements that said most museums simply are not equipped to care for them at the cost and the scale, let alone having places to place them and store them. I mean, I can just tell you that the number of phone calls that we got calls from Baltimore, we got calls from Kentucky, we being the American Civil War Museum, we got called, we can't. And so it's huge, it's a huge issue. I don't even know, and I think we asked, and Kim, you might have a better sense of this, you know, given how the care of the monuments is done now in the city budget, it's across several budgets, as we heard in one of the earlier commission meetings, right? I mean, it's, yeah, Sarah?
There's no maintenance except for grass cutting. right
Oh,
now.
okay. What about the lighting that he said? And
Yeah, like-
yeah, he said lighting, he said grass, he said the annual.
and removal of graffiti.
and graffiti.
Yeah, we've responded to cleaning statues, not just graffiti, but the pine tar, and other acts of vandalism. A lot of times the lights are smashed
Mhm.
and things of that nature. They were cleaned some decades ago, but they have not been maintained at a,
Lee is maintained regularly.
Yes, it is. And
that's state
Yeah,
funded.
that's why it's
Right.
The state
Exactly.
Right.
contributes to
Yeah, and I
maintaining.
don't know the exact number, but I know that there's not an inconsiderable amount of money involved in that. And it was just a restoration, of course, of the Washington equestrian that, I mean, any museum who would even consider this would have to look at those numbers to assess whether they would do that.
Yes. Just a small note on maintenance of monuments. If you maintain them, it's like keeping your car waxed. If you keep it waxed, you don't have to repaint it. But if you never keep it waxed, then you get in trouble and it costs big money.
Mhm.
And surprisingly, from what I've learned, the Arthur Ashe statue is in really terrible condition. So
They're all.
they are, but it wasn't cast at the same
Yeah.
level.
So, I apologize.
Oh, no, just on that note, I know that the bird cage was restored and the Hollywood
Monroe's-
Cemetery,
Yeah,
Monroe's
tomb.
tomb,
Mhm.
Monroe's tomb, and that was, I'm sorry, I called it a bird cage.
No, that's.
But do you, I can't recall the figure for having restored that, but I know it was a phenomenal amount of tax dollars spent on that.
So,
But
All this is-
under the code, that's part of the requirement, right?
It's part of the
Under
requirement,
the
but
federal-
is it
the
somewhere around
state and-
60,000 or somewhere like that?
Mhm.
I wouldn't be surprised. So, but I think our point here really is probably the question I think really is, so what kind of data are we gathering, how are we sorting it? And Christy, you mentioned earlier there are already some sorting
Yes.
going on. So could you just reiterate those categories that we're already
Right.
sorting it into?
Absolutely. So we have what I said were what we call the blind cells. The blind cells have the salutation, the person's name, full name, first and last name. It also has their addresses, and for some individuals, it's also their email that was attached to it, as well as in a couple cases, it's phone numbers. So those are the hidden cells. I'm not sure about anybody in this room, but I don't know if I want everybody on the planet to have access to that level of personal information, which is part of the reason why in this spreadsheet anyway, it was compressed as a hidden cell. So then, then the others are a general, the first thing asks them, in your opinion, and this goes up with the city website that we have, that said, in your opinion, what should be done with the monument? Some people filled in that cell, some people did not. Then the overall message or the letter that was sent. And again, whether it came in through the website or whether it came in through snail mail, we have captured every single one that we have, or at least have them out there scanned so that they can go into this database. The next cell says simply keep. So we're ticking off how many people in their letters are saying keep the monuments. We have one that says remove, and we're ticking off how many people are saying remove. We also have a cell that says add context or information. one that says add monuments, and then we have relocate as another cell, and then we have one that, the final one that is the specific suggestions or recommendations. And that's how it is currently set up. So Julian, actually, all of the commission members do have access to this. I sent that information out. Yeah.
I've seen it, yeah.
Yeah, so if you have other suggestions about how we can, pull this data cleaner or tighter so that there is better summations or what have you, we can certainly talk about that
Right, yeah.
offline.
Well, I guess my ultimate question was just about classification, right? About
Okay.
sooner or later, these entries are going to be made public, and people are going to want to know who wants them torn down, who wants added context, who wants added monuments, and who wants them left alone. And there's a lot to pull from that, but we're going to have to find a way to.
It sounds like we have those categories
We do,
built
right?
in.
And
Yeah.
and that's, I guess, what
Yeah.
it's just a kind of condensed classification
Yes.
before people go in, and I was just asking like how that's going to be put. Will people see what we see when we make them
Yes.
public? Okay, right.
I think that's the only fair way to do it,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and that was my basic question.
Okay,
That's a
okay.
good question, because, and then, we may decide we want to drill down further into some of those.
Right.
So add monuments, well, how many votes did George H. Thomas get? Or
Right.
whoever you want who's been mentioned, so.
Oh, he's been
Yeah.
mentioned quite a bit.
Quite a bit, I'm sure he has.
Elizabeth Van Loo, George Thomas, a monument to women in general.
Right. So I didn't have any suggestions. I was just
Yeah.
want to know
Okay.
if people were going to see what we saw.
Yes,
Right, right.
yes.
Cool.
Okay, so I'll do two more and then we'll move on to the next agenda item. So, this one says, I advocate for the removal of the Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue as they continue to stand as a reminder of a failed revolt against the United States, placing those who fought in that war in a glorified and honored status. Along with that status, they serve as a reminder of the battles that keep people enslaved and to continue the profitable for some trade in human trafficking. In their place, a contextual explanation of the monument's original placement, funding, intention, and city planning of the Monument Avenue, similar to the slave trail placards, which put each place along the trail in context from their perspective of those experiencing it both today and in the past. Understanding the slave trade and its impact on Richmond specifically and the southern slave regions is most important to fully understand the misinterpretation of states' rights and exactly what those rights were. The right to enslave humans for unpaid labor. Aberrant and unacceptable to turn a blind eye to their true and intended meaning. It said, this is interesting even though I'm not, okay. So if the monuments are left as they are and contextualized, the fact that their installation was funded by private citizens should be noted, along with references to notable people who contributed and a statement about the people whose voices rose in dissent or those who were absent from the decision-making process. I am concerned that public funds needed to ameliorate the unequal systems perpetuated by the racial, economic, political, and social divides symbolized by the monuments, such as the persistently underperforming and underfunded Richmond Public Schools will be diverted to fund whatever actions the Commission prescribes in regard to the monuments. It would be a civic and moral failure. And at the same time, relying only on private funds avoids responsibility that those public monuments are our collective problem. Perhaps a combination of public and private funding could be explored for whatever actions are prescribed by the Commission. These monuments are symbolic of much deeper, much more disruptive and harmful divides within Richmond and the surrounding region that must be closed now, not later. The citizens disadvantaged by these divides have waited much too long already for these inequities to be addressed in a multifaceted, meaningful, and sustainable way. Hopefully, this conversation can be a catalyst for significant and lasting improvements.
Do you feel that,
Mhm.
based on the letters you have seen since August 13th, did the breakdown change? You said,
It did. It did. What we've seen so far is that it's become far more centralized into, okay, so tell me what adding information means. Let's talk about adding other people to the mix, is what we're seeing more in this 500 post-Charlottesville set. A lot of the letters also that came in, especially those that came in, I guess between like August 15, 16 to the end of the month, when everything was still very fresh, there was a lot of pleading in it. In a lot of the letters, you know, people were saying, please, please, please don't let our city devolve into this. Please, 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 you know, make sure that people are listening. Please, please, please think about this. Please, please, you know, we saw more of that than we did in the first half. And so, and like I said, so the tenor became more central than it was in the first part, where people, the majority had either pushed themselves in one side or another. And I think part of the issue is, I think in the beginning, is people really weren't sure what does add context mean. You know, what does that even mean? And they just had no idea what that would mean or what it could look like. And so that was, now this is the last comment before moving on, because I think this is one that kind of I found interesting personally. This is the city of monuments. If they are removed, what will the city be known for? Tourism is very important for all of us. I'm proud of beautiful art, the crown jewels of Richmond. Will anything change if they're gone? No, just economic tourism impact. I'll proudly show off Monument and other sections of our beautiful city and its monuments. There's history, good, bad, and indifferent. Keep building on this. Keep showing the world who we are and that we've come to grips with. So, again, commissioners, feel free to dig deeper. And again, we did get other letters. We got letters from several camps of the SCB and the UDC. We've got very impassioned letters from several social justice organizations in the community. We've gotten letters from artists in the community who want to help participate in this conversation as well. And as some of you may or may not know, there are a number of initiatives that are taking place in the city that are apart from this work, meaning apart from the commission or the city proper. There, you know, some of you may have read about BCU Arts is leading an initiative to reimagine Monument Avenue, and they received a major grant to do that, to look at that work. Here's some copies of that came through. Also had a conversation with a collective of artists on the south side in Manchester that, you know, also have been playing with some ideas about this. And then there's also been, the wonderful thing here is that people are starting to actually talk to each other about what is possible, and there is this idea of a monumental city takes on a really interesting opportunity. But I'm not sure how that will work, and I certainly, you know, we just have to see what these groups are coming up with, and ultimately that's our goal. So what we've done, one of the other things moving along on the agenda, because we are running late and I apologize for that, is that some of the organizations, the museums in the city got together and put together on Monument Avenue to provide resources from their archival and photographic collections to support the work of the commission. Led by ACWM, but heavily supported by the Valentine Museum, the Library of Virginia, and the Virginia Historical Society. So I'm going to ask if Stephanie Arduini and Dr. Michael Grant will come forward for about 5 minutes, please. And just for those of you who are not familiar with the site, can do that.
I have a question about the last topic really quickly. How long will the comment section be up on the Monument Avenue Commission website?
It's supposed to stay up as long as we're up.
So through April, possibly?
Mhm.
Would it make sense to have kind of a toggle button for people to say, this is, now that we kind of see a breakdown from a set of data, you know, how things are going in general, we know all the topics in maybe one open-ended one. This is the camp I'm in, or these are the 2 camps I'm in, just to make your job easier on the tail end of it?
That's what the first button is supposed to do, but people,
But
it's not a
open-ended
requirement,
question.
it's open.
It's
Right.
yeah, but if you just had a toggle, it would make it easier to kind of.
Stephanie?
Again, just,
Yeah,
I
good
apologize,
suggestion. Thank
but
you.
try to use your mic when you're speaking so that the folks who came from the public can hear. So yeah, come on up.
Where would you like us around the mic?
Good question. I can bring this one over here. And I know it's not exactly.
That's fine.
Actually, you can take it on the stand if you want. And here's the computer. And sorry, either way. How do you do it?
Good evening, everyone. So at the American Civil War Museum, as well as Christy mentioned, in collaboration with the Virginia Historical Society, the Library of Virginia, and the Valentine, we created a micro website called onmonumentav.com to consolidate a lot of the resources we have, as well as to help citizens of Richmond and beyond think about the question of Confederate monuments, Civil War monuments broadly, but especially Confederate monuments, and to feel like they have the tools to be more comfortable and confident engaging in these public dialogues. So originally, as we imagined them, we created a couple of different components. This is the landing page for that website. We created I'll start first with the reading list, which we see a lot of syllabuses or syllabi about current topics, but we wanted to create something a little more digestible, and there are a selection of resources around topics that relate to this larger dialogue, and where we could, creating excerpts from those books or articles so that people can download the most salient portions of them, as well as quick descriptions of what we like about those resources. We also created a reader that we have printed and distributed widely. I've got some copies here, but I'm going to link some, that represent selections of primary sources from the moment of conception of Monument Avenue all the way up through the present, representing a variety of the perspectives that we've seen historically about the monuments, from everything from Jubal Early suggesting, hey, we need a monument to Robert E. Lee, all the way up through 2016 and the Civil War Trust. There are a couple of selections from historians representing contemporary questions that historians are asking, and a selection of reflection or discussion questions at the end. So we have this available online, and we've also been printing them, distributing them at our museum, as well as events such as the Richmond Folk Festival. We printed them off and had them available, and have been taking them and distributing them widely. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback about those. We have launched one online exhibit and plan to launch the second by the end of this week. The first details the birth of Monument Avenue, so exploring the origins of each of the individual Confederate statues and who was involved, what the decision-making process was like, what the design process was like, and highlighting a lot of the documents involved, and even some of the news coverage and artifacts that we have in our collection. The second that we'll be launching soon will include the evolution and accrual of meanings to these statues. So starting from Civil War, especially Confederate reunions, all the way up through questions of tourism and protest to the present day. So how did Monument Avenue, the statues particularly on Monument Avenue, add meanings over time, and what are those meanings, and how do we see those represented in documents or artifacts. The other things we've added, so the first link up there beyond the home is a blog series that we at the American Civil War Museum have been writing that helps to connect the dots a little more broadly than what we see in the specific documents tied to the specific statues at Monument Avenue. So if we're talking about how ex-Confederates were reimagining their place in the world after the Civil War, we have some blog posts that explore what that is and how we can see those trends. If we're exploring, for example, it's not the most recent one, but how women's organizations were taking leadership roles in creating, not only helping to fundraise for the statues, but also helping to lead the building of statues. We have some that expand to beyond Monument Avenue to other statues and organizations and efforts in Richmond and beyond, even into Virginia. So helping users to connect the dots to beyond what we could see in the specific documents tied to the Monument Avenue statues, but that were definitely part of a larger context. And then as we've been doing this, and as we've been approached for people who are asking questions about Monument Avenue, we've found a couple of different things. Is that some people just want to hear other stories about perspectives that aren't their own, but that in person it often escalates to debate. So they're curious about wanting to hear more, but when they hear more, sometimes it escalates immediately to debate. So we've started at some of our programs that the American Civil War Museum has done to create these feedback cards that we're anonymizing, so we're removing the names when we have to and the email addresses, but uploading some of these individual perspectives about how the statues on Monument Avenue make them feel. What else do they want to know? And we have also been facilitating dialogic conversations in the community when we've been approached, either providing historical context about the statues on Monument Avenue, or just providing some guide rails on the conversation to help groups that are pre-existing in the community figure out how they feel about it and helping them to express those feelings and hear other perspectives. So far, we've been getting great feedback, especially on the reader, but on this microsite overall. And our latest numbers are that it has 7,129 unique visitors, 1,100 page views. Over 50% of those views and users come from social media, especially Facebook, since we have been boosting those Facebook posts online. And in the last month, the most popular content has been the homepage, as well as some of those blog posts that we've been putting out on about a weekly basis. Do any of you have any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Excellent.
We do have, I mentioned VCU, and I understand that, is Camden Whitehead still here? Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Could you, maybe in 2 to 3 minutes, tell us a little bit about this initiative, please?
Sure.
Please stand and then come
Okay.
with the microphone.
2 years ago in the fall, the MOB Studio, which stands for the Middle Abroad, conducted a charrette of sorts with the students in the studio. We asked the students to consider a prosthetic device for the Lee Monument. They came up with 30 some odd devices for a device that would change the interpretation of the monument. Out of that, we had a really productive panel discussion, and then from that, we decided to make an application to the NEA to conduct a national competition to essentially reconsider Monument Avenue. We were informed that we got that grant last fall about this time, and since then we've been sort of laying the groundwork. Our intention is to announce the competition in April of 2018, and then it'll be open for entries through the summer, and entries will be due on December 1st, 2018. We have a commitment from the Valentine to show the entries, the winning entries, the accepted entries, in February of 2019. So that's our status at this point.
Thank you.
If I could add one more thing. Not planned. One of the things we found in doing community engaged projects at the Mob Studio is that design has a unique ability to offer much more nuanced approaches than have been, I guess, proffered so far. That you know, we haven't thought about ways to reinterpret. I think it's extensively as could be proposed by designers, architects, planners around the world. And I think if you remember the Vietnam Memorial competition, I think that had over 1,500 entries. The whole spectrum of political responses. The winning entry, which was built, was the woman who designed it, Maya Lin, was publicly degraded. It was a really ugly, messy scene. There was a compromise made of putting statues at the end of the monument. But I think once it was built, I think it was able to capture an incredibly complex war. It simultaneously memorialized the people who gave their lives in the war and the tragedy of war at the same time. And I think design has that capability to offer that kind of nuance, to both celebrate someone who gave their life, but also speak to the ugliness of war. I think we can accomplish the same thing on Monument Avenue.
Actually, Madam Co-Chair, I think that's a great segue into the final part of our conversation tonight.
Yeah, so where do we go from here?
It is, and I think it hints at exactly where we would like to, I think, go, but we obviously need to talk to all of you about it. And that is to really kind of flip the script on what we have done in terms of public input and go to the people. Obviously, we still have Monument Avenue, commission.org is still live. People can still comment, and we hope they will continue to do so. But our next step is really to go out and talk to interest groups, to community groups, and really get into the community and find out what is on their mind. It includes a wide range: heritage organizations, social justice organizations, historical preservation, and a variety of others. So, would it be appropriate to discuss that idea?
Please.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, let's give it a little bit of context. So because we didn't have our September planned meeting, a number of organizations throughout the community reached out to a number of us, right? Can you come and talk to my group? And many of us did that. We went out and we talked 2 by 2 or 1 by 1 at different group meetings just to hear, and it went, at least the ones that I attended, went, I thought, really well, and that was the general feedback. So then, as we were kind of tossing ideas around, we said, okay, there are a lot of groups out, rather than us trying to say, okay, we got to find this group, we got to find this group, the groups that want us to come and talk, that we extend an invitation and say, okay, you guys organize it, you tell us where you want us to be, and we will send, at least 2 commissioners out to you to hear and to dialogue with you around these questions and others. And so that was just, us thinking about that might be a more manageable thing, and it allows us a greater reach. And to be able to capture the sentiments of the various groups that we do meet. So that's the premise of the idea. So they say, talk amongst yourselves.
And that's reflected in a lot of the input we've received, because there are a lot of organizations who've written, and I think it's probably would be more effective. And these meetings don't have to all be run the same way.
Right.
If we are interacting with an art organization, it might be a charrette, rather than just a straight dialogue. So one thing we will need to do, and we will pay attention to this, because there's only 10 of us, is I think we're probably going to respond to some folks and say, well, maybe we can put 2 or 3 things together here. So if someone came to us with, say, a coalition of groups that were around, say, art, that would be more effective and a better use of our time. We're going to have to do a little bit of selection there, because there's only so much time. From our conversations, it sounds like we have a more extended timeline now.
Right.
Than we had before. So we are really, the conversations we've had with the mayor and his folks has been to do this starting in January and probably go through April. So, Ornette?
I want to mention that regarding the activities, Julie and I have spoken at the University of Richmond, and I know you have spoken with the Richmond Peace Education Center, and I suppose there are others as well. Is there a place on the website where we could note where we have spoken, like under the Monument Avenue Commission?
Okay, well we need to switch out that to the commission website, please. And that's an excellent suggestion. We talked about providing a link on there. What's something that we can do is for people to make their requests for commissioners, but we can also put what you're talking about in there. I don't think that would be problematic. That wouldn't be problematic, mayor people, city hall people, right?
No.
Thank you.
And of course, we will need to look at some of the details of how we launch that, but yeah, that would be the concept that would come through here, and it would be great to know where everyone's spoken. So if all the commissioners could contribute that, that would be fantastic, because I know we've all individually done a lot of this already.
So can you guys, what's a good deadline to send us where you've been in since the last public meeting? Can you send that out to us? Yeah, just email it to copy Greg and I, please.
And so moving forward, as we speak at public meeting or events, or where we've been invited, would we be able to put that information in ourselves, or do we go through?
We have to submit it through the webmaster.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we probably want to coordinate for the entire commission, because I think it is useful to have 2 people go, and obviously we have different expertise. And so I think, it may depend on what the group is, but not to say you don't feel like you can't go out and do things if people ask you at all, but I think for the larger effort, we may want to do some coordinating of that. That'd be my impression. You're right, some people just want to know what's going on, and it's very simple. It's really more us giving them information.
Yeah.
But I think, again, what we're trying to do here is really find out what's on their mind and how they view what's happening. Any other thoughts from other commission members? Does that seem like a reasonable direction to move?
How do you plan on letting groups know that we're open to meeting with them or with a group of groups?
That's John Bilals' job. No, I'm just kidding.
Well,
No, it really is.
There's certain parts of that, right? I mean, I think we need to define what those parts are. If the general timeline is defined, that we have more time, that we've got, say, January then we need to decide well, what, is it, who's best to take a Tuesday night, or who's best to take a Wednesday night, because that's, that's Bible
Yeah.
study night, or, there's a church group, or groups that want, right, or whatever. So I think we need to kind of define what that space is, and then there are those who may want a weekend day. So, I mean, I think we have to define what that is, and go from there.
But I do think that this, the requests need to come through a central place, and that is the mayor's office. So, this is, that's the appropriate venue. I know that Jim and John will work on what suits best for us. And we did consider some buckets, basically, to put these various kind of groups in, and ones in a general way that we were looking at, like historic preservation and art, etc. So,
Is this instead of or in addition to a public forum like the previous one that we had with the is that?
I think it's a combination, right? And, I mean, I wasn't there, I was virtually there as everybody was live streaming and what have you, but it seems like we probably could get more accomplished when we're having the one-on-ones. I think certainly after we compile all of that, it's important to sit down and present wherever, what that is, where we're landing based on what we're hearing, so that we can make that recommendation.
I mean, I think my personal opinion, and I don't know what the rest of the commissioners think, but I did not find that very useful. And I think, again, the idea is that we should be promoting dialogue, and I think this is a much more effective way to do that.
I didn't find that useful, but maybe that was our fault. I heard a lot of people say that it would be nice to hear a lot more opinions from people who live in Richmond, and I think we were maybe at 50-50. I don't know, did anyone count about the folks who spoke up? And a lot of people were turned away at the door because they didn't know, that there would be such a big turnout. So if there were a venue where maybe you don't belong to a group, you're just a citizen, but you're a Richmonder, and this is, this is your home turf.
I would argue that the website is a place for an individual to make their thoughts known,
Yeah.
and that will be public.
Yeah.
I personally, I guess my opinion is that I don't want to be checking people's ID cards at the door to find out if they're a Richmond citizen, which is why I think going to community groups that exist is a really reasonable way to actually hear what Richmonders have to say. That's just my view. Yeah.
As hard as it is, and having served, I guess I'm going into 9 years of being an elected official, I think an important part of our process is a public hearing or public comment. People want to know that they're being heard and that they're on the record. So I do think that I like the dialogue piece, and I like that we're going to be doing more outreach, but I do think that at some point between this January and April period, however difficult it might be, I think that we may want to move towards allowing for that voicing and comment period and have a hearing before any decisions are finalized on the part of the commission. I just think it's an important part of the process.
Other thoughts?
So you're saying after we've done all this, Kim, you're saying after we've talked to all these organizations and we put something together to have a general meeting and hand out that information and have people comment on it?
I'm not specifically saying how it needs to be done. I'm just saying that as a public body, public comment and having a public hearing of some sort is a necessary part of our democracy. I just fundamentally believe it's difficult, and I've sat through dozens of hours at a time of hearings on a range of topics, and it's not easy, and people will personally attack and say things that aren't always nice, but it's a part of our democratic process, and I think it's an important part. And I know it's harder. It was very difficult going into public service to have to be thrown into that. So I know that that's not an experience that folks are generally used to, but it's part of the process of service, public service, and it's difficult, but I think necessary.
So you don't think talking to organizations is enough, is what you're saying?
No, I don't think that's enough. I don't think that gets us to where people in the general public feel they've had an opportunity to be heard.
Well, maybe a mix then.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
I think from what I've heard and from what I think we, the city and the state and the country have seen since our first meeting till now, I think having the private meetings is paramount to get good input from those who are Richmonders who felt like they might not have been able to attend that first forum. But I think that taking that information and coming back to a table like this and figuring out what is that next public session forum meeting looking like. Is it part of a presentation? Is it more outreach and other topics or breaking up into groups? I don't know. But I think doing what Kim Gray has mentioned is, I think, crucial to making sure we do this in the most public, transparent, and accountable way so that we are able to make an informed public decision at the end of this. And I think that that first piece of getting out to the community, faith-based local community organizations, groups that live and work and breathe in our city is the first thing we have to do. Because it's there we hear the people who might not be willing to send that email, fill out a form on a website, or call us to tell us what we think that they want to know. This is a chance to meet them where they live, and they oftentimes are more open, and that's the conversation we're missing right now. And I think this is a great step to do that. And I don't know what the next step is. And I think we need to find that together.
I think that's an excellent balance. Is what I'm hearing is that, we will certainly make ourselves available, as we said, for groups to reach out and for us to come out and hear you where you live. And then we will come back, and it might not be a bad idea to come back twice. Maybe it's just once, maybe it's twice, I don't know. We'll figure that out depending on what kind of response we get. But it does require engagement from the citizens. We're not going to pick where we go. I mean, you got to tell us if you want us there. And so we can do that. And it is helpful to bring all of that back, because we are going to hear varying things depending on where we're going, and it'd be a good idea to compile that in a form and then give people a chance. Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
And you're talking about mixing the commissioners up, like Colleen and I, who are both in conservation, wouldn't go together somewhere, right?
You might, if it's a group of artists that are trying to get together and want to talk about it, why wouldn't you?
You might want to,
Depends on what they want.
Depends on the audience.
Yeah.
They ask for it. Whatever group might need different combination of this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we're all very open to what those combinations are, but I think there will be situations where a group will, again, it's really about expertise and who can communicate most effectively and bring that back to the full commission too. That's obviously incredibly important. So yeah, I'm fine with doing another public hearing or whatever we decide to do that's more on the sort of open format. I think it would be useful to get some, maybe partway through the community outreach piece, and so that we can try to get some focus to because again, for me, it's simply to let people address what we're asking them to address is probably what I'm really interested in. But
And I wonder, Greg, if, like in your written comments, there'll be a different tone to the conversations post August 13th. And I don't know why we couldn't be willing to say, if you're a Richmonder, you're invited to come to, if you live in the city of Richmond, you're invited to come to the VHS Did we check IDs? I don't know, maybe it's just on your honor.
I apologize, I didn't mean to be facetious, but I just don't know how to do that. Right? Maybe there is a way, maybe they do that at city council. They probably, I don't know, I'm just kidding.
It sounds to me like we learned plenty from the first about how to do this more effectively the second time. Right.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, you're right.
Stick to the time you
right.
said.
I'm all for it.
Follow
Right?
it,
I mean,
yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, gotta definitely respect that. I know it's a different position that you're in, Kim, than some
I'd
of
like to
us.
add also that I was at the September 16th rally on Monument Avenue, and after the morning antics that went on, the discussions that were being had there were very meaningful and just really powerful and great to see. So I think that we have gone through a lot together, and it would be nice to see what people are talking about now.
I just want to say one more thing about the forum that we, I found it interesting, particularly in light of what happened on the 13th. And I think we might have all thought that that meeting was going to go a particular way. But in light of what transpired after that meeting, I thought that, we were disappointed with some of the comments, but given what's transpired throughout the United States over the last 6 or 7 months, that was relatively, I don't want to say civil. Right. But it wasn't, I mean, forgive me, but it wasn't a debacle that I thought the media portrayed it to be the next day in many ways. And I think we've learned some valuable lessons from that forum. I mean, as a historian, I'm trained to listen and read things that I don't necessarily agree with or that might be uncomfortable. It's part of what we do. And so I think it's an integral part to the public process. And I think we can learn from some of the mistakes that we made the first time. And I want to say this one more time. I mean, given what we've seen throughout the United States over the last several months, we need to be careful about, the nature in which we talk about how unruly that meeting actually was. Because I think in many ways, we learned a lot from that forum.
Good, well, it sounds like we have a consensus of some things that we need to do going forward. Obviously, we can work out a lot of the details of how the mechanism by which we do this, but it sounds like we have a consensus about how we move forward, which I appreciate.
Any other business from commissioners that you'd like to bring to the table before we adjourn?
Do we have to have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
A motion to adjourn?
And a second?
Aye.
All those in favor?